Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a real philosophical heavyweight bout, rationalism versus empiricism. You sent over some really fascinating excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and honestly, I'm really excited to dive into this with you, especially since you're a philosopher yourself.
It's a classic philosophical showdown, isn't it? This question of where does knowledge come from? Is it something we're born with, like some kind of pre-installed software, or does it all come from our experiences in the world?
That's the big question, right? And these excerpts we have lay out the battle lines pretty clearly. So the Stanford Encyclopedia article, it highlights these three key theses that kind of frame this whole debate: the intuition-deduction thesis, the innate knowledge thesis, and the innate concept thesis.
These are the big guns, the ones that really get to the heart of how rationalists and empiricists view the very foundations of knowledge. So let's maybe start with that first one, the intuition-deduction thesis. And you might be surprised to hear that both camps actually agree on this one, at least to some extent.
Oh, really? That's interesting. So where's the common ground?
Well, they both accept that we can gain knowledge through intuition, that kind of direct, immediate grasp of a truth, and through deduction, where we use logic to kind of derive new knowledge from what we already know.
Because it's like we've got this toolbox of basic concepts and logical principles, and we can use them to build up our understanding.
Exactly. It's like having this mental toolkit. The real battleground, though, emerges when we try to apply this thesis to knowledge of the external world, the world beyond our own minds.
Okay, I see where this is going. So rationalists like Descartes, they'd argue that we can know things about the world beyond our minds, things like mathematical truths or even the existence of God and all of that, just through intuition and deduction alone.
Precisely. They'd say we don't need to go out and observe the world to know these things. They're like these self-evident truths that our rational minds can grasp directly.
So for rationalists, the idea that 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's not something we learn from counting objects. It's a truth that our minds can just see, right? It's almost like it's built in.
That's the gist of it, yeah. It's a powerful idea, this notion that some knowledge is just inherent in the structure of our minds. But of course, the empiricists, they have something to say about that.
I bet they do. So how would an empiricist like Hume counter that argument?
Well, Hume, he made this crucial distinction between what he called relations of ideas and matters of fact.
Oh, I've heard of that. Tell me more.
So relations of ideas, these are truths that can be determined just by analyzing the concepts involved.
Yeah.
Like the classic example, all bachelors are unmarried. We don't need any empirical evidence to confirm that that's true just by virtue of how we define those terms.
Right. It's like a logical truth contained within the definitions themselves.
Exactly. And Hume argues that mathematical truths, they fall into this category as well. They're true because of how we define concepts like numbers and shapes, not because they're telling us something about the actual world.
So math, it's like a self-contained system with its own rules. We can derive all these interesting theorems, but ultimately they're grounded in those rules, not in observations of the outside world.
It's like a game with its own internal logic. And for Hume, matters of fact, on the other hand, these are propositions that can only be determined through experience, things like the sun rises in the east, that requires empirical observation. We need to go out and see it to know if it's true.
Okay, so that's a really important distinction then. For Hume mathematical knowledge, it's about the internal coherence of our ideas, while scientific knowledge, it's about discovering patterns in the world through our senses.
Precisely. It's like two different ways of knowing, two different lenses through which we understand the world.
That's fascinating. It seems like this distinction really sets the stage for the whole debate between rationalism and empiricism.
It does. It allows empiricists to acknowledge the certainty of mathematical truths while still maintaining that all our knowledge of the world ultimately stems from experience.
Okay, so we've tackled the intuition deduction thesis now. Where do we go from here?
Let's move on to the innate knowledge thesis. This one's even more controversial. It suggests that we're born with certain knowledge already built in, part of our rational nature.
So it goes beyond just having the capacity to learn. It's saying that certain knowledge is present right from the start, just waiting to be unlocked.
Exactly. And a classic example of this is Plato's theory of recollection. Remember that one?
Yeah, vaguely refresh my memory.
Well, he believed that learning is actually a process of remembering knowledge that our souls acquired before birth. It's almost like our souls went to philosophy school before we were even born.
Uh-huh. I like that image. But as a philosopher yourself, do you buy into that idea of pre-existing knowledge?
Well, it's definitely a thought-provoking concept, right? And it raises all sorts of questions. A more modern example that might resonate with you is Chomsky's concept of a universal grammar.
Oh, yeah. Chomsky, that rings a bell.
He argued that children, they learn language way too fast for it to be solely from experience. He proposed that humans must have this innate understanding of the basic structures of language, like a blueprint for grammar.
So it's like we're pre-wired with this linguistic framework that helps us make sense of the words and sentences we hear.
That's the idea. But of course, the empiricists, they have some strong objections to this whole innate knowledge thing.
I bet they do. What are some of their main criticisms?
Well, one major challenge is this question of how could knowledge be present in our minds without us being aware of it? If we're born with all this knowledge, why don't we remember it?
It's like if I had this whole library of innate knowledge, I should be able to access it, right?
Exactly. And another criticism is that even if we accept the possibility of innate knowledge, it's tricky to explain how it could be warranted, for a
Yeah.
belief to count as knowledge. It needs to be justified in some way. And empiricists, they argue that sensory experience or reflection on those experiences, that's the primary source of justification.
So if we can't trace a piece of knowledge back to some kind of experience, it's hard to see how we could be justified in believing it.
That's the empiricist perspective, and that brings us to our final thesis for today, the innate concept thesis. This one focuses specifically on the origin of the concepts we use to think and understand the world.
All right, so concepts like redness or justice or infinity, where do those come from?
That's the question, and rationalists, they argue that some concepts are so fundamental, so far removed from our direct experience that they must be innate.
So for them, it's like these concepts are the building blocks of thought. They have to be there from the beginning.
Exactly, and a classic example here is Descartes' argument for the innateness of the concept of God.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. How does that work?
Well, he said that our idea of God as this perfect infinite being, it's something we couldn't possibly derive from our limited experiences in the world. We never encounter perfect infinity in our day-to-day lives.
So it's like trying to imagine a color you've never seen before. You can combine existing colors in your mind, but can you truly conceive of something entirely new?
That's a great analogy, and for Descartes, the concept of God, it's like that it's so far beyond our finite experience that it must already be present in our minds.
That's an intriguing argument. It suggests that some concepts are so foundational that they can't be built from experience. They have to already be there. But how would an empiricist respond to that?
Well, as you might expect, they have some counter-arguments. They believe that all our concepts, even abstract ones like God or infinity, can ultimately be traced back to sensory experience.
So they wouldn't agree that anything has to be innate.
No, they'd say that our minds are incredibly powerful at taking simple ideas from experience and combining and manipulating them to create more complex concepts.
So even something like infinity could be built up from our experiences of things being big or going on for a long time.
Exactly. It's like building a complex structure from simpler building blocks. And they'd also point out that not everyone has the same concept of God, which would be hard to explain if it were truly innate and universal.
That's a good point. It seems like this debate is really heating up. So we've got these three intertwined theses: intuition, deduction, innate knowledge, and innate concepts. And both rationalists and empiricists have some compelling arguments. Where do we go from here to really dig into the specifics?
Well, I think it's time to explore some specific examples and see how well each theory accounts for them. That's where things get really interesting, putting these ideas to the test.
That sounds great. I'm ready to dive in. Are you?
Absolutely. Let's
Yeah.
do it. Let's go back to that intuition deduction thesis for a minute and how rationalists would use it to explain something like math, like our understanding of geometry.
Okay, so like the idea that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line.
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect example because no matter how many times we measure distances in the real world, we're never going to find a perfectly straight line. There's always some degree of imperfection.
Right. It's like the ideal form of a line only exists in our minds.
Precisely. And for rationalists, the fact that we can grasp that concept, of a perfectly straight line and understand its truth in a way that goes beyond our imperfect experiences, it suggests that we're accessing it through intuition and deduction. It's like this fundamental truth that our rational minds can grasp directly.
I can see how that would be a strong argument for the rationalist side. But how would an empiricist, someone like Hume, account for this kind of mathematical knowledge if it's not innate? How do we arrive at these seemingly universal and necessary truths?
Well, Hume, he makes that crucial distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact that we talked about before.
Right. Remind me about that again.
So relations of ideas, these are propositions whose truth can be determined just by analyzing the concepts involved, like all squares have four sides. That's true by definition. We don't need any real-world evidence to confirm that.
Right, it's like a logical truth that's just contained within the definition itself.
Right. Exactly. And Hume argues that mathematical truths, they fall into this category as well. They're true because of the way we define concepts like numbers and shapes, not because they're telling us something about the actual world.
So it's like math is this kind of self-contained system with its own set of rules. We can derive all these interesting theorems and relationships, but they're ultimately based on those rules, not on observations of the physical world.
It's like a language game with its own internal logic.
Okay, I see. So for Hume, mathematical knowledge, it's all about the internal coherence of our ideas, while scientific knowledge is about discovering these regularities in the world around us through our senses.
Precisely. It's like two different modes of knowing, two different lenses through which we understand the world.
That's fascinating. So this distinction, it allows empiricists to acknowledge the certainty of mathematical truths without having to say that they're innate.
Exactly. They can say, yes, math is certain, but that's because it's a closed system based on our own definitions, not because it reflects some pre-existing knowledge about the universe.
That's a really interesting way to approach it. It seems like both sides have some strong points. But what about that innate knowledge thesis? Are there any examples that really support the idea that we're born with certain knowledge about the world?
Well, some proponents, they point to Plato's theory of recollection, as we mentioned before. They argue that certain experiences can trigger the recall of knowledge that was present in our minds all along.
So kind of like how a particular smell can suddenly evoke a vivid memory from childhood.
Yeah, exactly. There's a sense in which certain experiences can kind of unlock knowledge that was seemingly hidden or dormant within us.
But it makes you wonder, are we really remembering something that was always there, or were we just learning something new based on those experiences?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of that whole nature versus nurture debate, right? Are we born with certain predispositions, or do they develop through our interactions with the world? And it's a question that applies to knowledge as well.
Absolutely. So are there any other arguments for innate knowledge besides Plato's theory?
Well, a more contemporary argument comes from philosophers like Peter Carruthers. Have you heard of him?
The name rings a bell, but I'm not super familiar with his work.
Well, he argues that we have innate knowledge of the principles of folk psychology.
Folk psychology. What's that?
It refers to our common sense understanding of how people's minds work. You know, how their beliefs, desires, and intentions kind of influence their behavior. We use folk psychology all the time to explain and predict why people do the things they do.
Oh, I see. So it's like our intuitive theory of mind is how we make sense of other people's thoughts and actions.
Exactly. And Carruthers, he argues that this understanding of folk psychology, it's so complex and nuanced and so universally shared that it's unlikely to be something we learn entirely from experience.
Especially considering how early on children seem to develop that understanding of other people's minds.
Yeah, that's a key part of his argument. He points out that children as young as 5, they already show this remarkable grasp of folk psychological principles. You know, they use it to navigate social situations, and he suggests that this kind of sophisticated understanding, it points to some degree of innate knowledge.
So while we might learn specific details about individuals through experience, the underlying framework for understanding how minds work might already be in place.
That's the essence of his argument. Of course, this raises further questions about the nature of this innate knowledge, you know, how it's acquired and how it interacts with our experiences, but it's definitely a thought-provoking idea.
It certainly challenges that blank slate view of the mind. But what about that innate concept thesis? How do rationalists defend the idea that certain concepts are innate, and how do empiricists respond? I'm particularly interested in how this plays out with something like our concept of God.
That's a great question. And as we discussed before, Descartes, he believed that the concept of God is a prime example of an innate concept. He argued that this idea of a perfect infinite being, it's something we couldn't possibly construct from our limited imperfect experiences in the world.
It's like trying to imagine a color you've never seen before.
Yeah.
You can combine existing colors in your mind, but can you truly conceive of something entirely new?
Exactly. And for Descartes, the concept of God is like it's so far beyond our finite experience that it must already be present in our minds.
Okay, I can see how that argument works. But I'm guessing Locke, as a champion of empiricism, he had a different take on this.
He did indeed. Locke argued that even complex concepts like God or infinity, they can be broken down into simpler ideas that are rooted in sensation and reflection.
So for Locke, our concept of God might be built up from experiences of power, wisdom, goodness, and then extended to this idea of an ultimate all-encompassing being.
Precisely, he believed that our minds, they're incredibly adept at combining and manipulating simple ideas that are derived from experience to create more complex ones. He'd say nothing is truly beyond the reach of experience.
That's a very different way of looking at it. But how would Locke explain our concept of something like color? I mean, surely the experience of seeing red is different from the concept of redness itself.
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the empiricist account of concepts. Locke would say that we acquire the concept of redness through abstraction. We see many red objects, and our minds extract this common feature that unites them, forming this abstract concept of redness.
So it's like our minds are creating these mental templates based on the patterns and regularities we observe.
Exactly. However, this process of abstraction has been challenged. Critics point out that not all instances of a concept share identical features. There are countless shades of red, for example, and it's not clear what common feature unites them all.
It's like trying to define family resemblance. We can recognize that members of a family share certain traits, but there's no single defining characteristic that applies to everyone.
That's a great analogy. It highlights the complexity of trying to explain how these abstract concepts emerge from our concrete experiences. And there's another challenge to Locke's account. It seems to require a degree of circularity.
Circularity, how so?
Well, to recognize that different shades of red share something in common, wouldn't we need to already possess the concept of redness in the first place? It's like we need the concept to even begin that process of abstraction.
Ah, I see the problem. It's like saying we need to know what a dog is before we can start grouping different breeds of dogs together.
Exactly. And the circularity problem, it poses a significant challenge to these purely empiricist accounts of concept formation.
Hmm.
It suggests that there might be some underlying cognitive structures or predispositions that guide our ability to categorize and conceptualize the world.
So while experience might provide the raw material, our minds might come equipped with certain tools that help us make sense of it all. It's fascinating how this debate keeps circling back to that fundamental question. Is it nature-nurture or some intricate dance between the two?
It's a fascinating dance indeed, and as we delve deeper into these specific examples, we see just how intertwined these ideas really are. Shall we explore another one?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm ready for more. It really is amazing how these seemingly simple questions about where our concepts come from can lead to such deep philosophical waters. Like we're peeling back the layers of reality and questioning the very foundations of how we understand the world.
You're absolutely right, and these questions, they have these huge implications, not just for how we understand concepts, but for the whole enterprise of knowledge and inquiry, how we approach science, philosophy, everything.
Speaking of knowledge, you mentioned earlier that Hume had this radical reinterpretation of causation.
Hmm.
I'm really curious to hear more about that, especially since causation seems so fundamental to how we understand the world. Cause and effect. It's everywhere.
It's a real mind bender for sure. You see, for rationalists like Descartes, the concept of causation was innate. It seemed like this basic principle woven into the fabric of reality. But Hume, ever the empiricist, he saw things a bit differently.
Okay, I'm all ears. How did Hume shake things up?
Well, he argued that what we perceive as this necessary connection between cause and effect, it's actually just a feeling of expectation based on our repeated experiences.
Yeah.
It's like if we see the same sequence of events happen over and over again, let's say a billiard ball striking another ball and causing it to move, we start to anticipate that outcome.
Right, we see the pattern and we come to expect it, but does Hume really think that's all there is to causation, just a feeling of expectation?
He's saying that our idea of causation, it's not reflecting some kind of objective, necessary connection out there in the world. It's more like a psychological habit that our minds create based on these repeated observations.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim. It seems to challenge our whole notion of scientific explanation,
Sure.
Which relies on identifying these underlying causes.
It definitely raises some profound questions about the limits of scientific knowledge, and it highlights just how important it is to carefully examine these concepts we use to understand the world, to make sure we're not just projecting our own mental frameworks onto reality.
It's like a reminder that what we perceive as common sense
Yeah.
might not always hold up under philosophical scrutiny.
Yeah.
Are we really seeing the world as it is, or are we just kind of imposing our own interpretations on it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this whole debate between rationalism and empiricism, it really forces us to grapple with that.
As a philosopher yourself, I'd love to hear your take on this. Where do you land in this debate?
For me, it's not about picking a side. It's more about appreciating the strengths and weaknesses of each perspective and how they push us to think more deeply about the nature of knowledge. Rationalism, it highlights the power of reason and the importance of clear logical thinking, while empiricism, it reminds us of the vital role of sensory experience and the limits of pure reason.
So it's like both perspectives offer valuable insights, even if they sometimes lead to conflicting conclusions.
Exactly. And I think the real value of this whole debate lies in the questions it raises. It forces us to examine our assumptions about the world and how we come to know it.
It's like philosophy is holding up a mirror to our
Ugh.
own minds and asking, how do you work? How do you make sense of this vast and complex universe?
Beautifully put. And, there are no easy answers, which is part of what makes philosophy so endlessly fascinating.
Couldn't agree more. Well, we've journeyed through some pretty dense philosophical territory today, exploring the origins of knowledge, the nature of concepts, and even the idea of causation itself. I have to say, this has been a truly enlightening deep dive.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and especially with a fellow philosopher. It's always a richer conversation when we can kind of delve into these nuances together.
Absolutely. And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey.
Sure.
I hope it sparks some new thoughts and maybe even a few philosophical debates of your own. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those philosophical gears turning.